Tower, JetBlue 1528 is outside Zapple, ILS 22 left.
JetBlue 1528, Kennedy, ground, wind 230 runway 22 left for the line.
Good to land, JetBlue 1528. You're on tower, right?
I'm sorry, say again?
You said Kennedy ground. I'm just confirming we are talking tower.
Yeah, it's been a long night. This is the tower, 22 left for the line.
Tell me about it. 1528, clear to land.
Yes, it's always good to know who you're talking with, especially when landing at JFK. Our thanks to liveatc.net for that clip. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with news and safety tips for pilots and student pilots. I'm Max Truscott. Today we're talking about advanced avionics for both renter pilots and aircraft owners. First, we'll talk briefly about learning the avionics you already have, and then we'll talk about strategies for upgrading the avionics in your plane, or if you're a renter pilot, for encouraging the owner of the plane you rent to upgrade their avionics. And we'll also talk about new avionics introduced last week at the AEA show in Palm Springs, California. And if you're listening to us for the first time, please touch the subscribe button so new shows will be downloaded each week for free on your smartphone. And if you have ever thought about maybe someday buying a Cirrus SR20, SR22, or SF50 Vision Jet, or would like flight training in one, please call me today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 103, we heard from a pilot who had an engine failure over water, and he talked about his rescue. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. This week in the news, we're going to talk about an airline that flies small general aviation aircraft, and they're going all electric. And we'll tell you about two pilots arrested in separate cases for human smuggling at adjacent airports here in the United States. All this and more, and the news starts now. From TheGuardian.com, a Nebraska city walled off by massive flooding has been getting a lift from private pilots who are offering free flights to shuttle stranded residents to and from their hometown. Flooding from the Platte River and other waterways has been so bad that just one highway lane into Fremont remained uncovered, according to authorities. Emergency responders restricted access for safety reasons, which left residents in the city of 26,000 stuck on an island in the middle of a Nebraska farm country about 40 miles northwest of Omaha. The flooding in Fremont came as communities in several Midwestern states grappled with swollen rivers and breached or overtopped levees following heavy rain and snowmelt. The makeshift shuttle flights have led to a surge in air traffic at the Fremont Municipal Airport and its two runways. Pilots have flown in from at least 5 nearby airports in Nebraska, as well as other airports in western Iowa and Kansas, according to the city's airport operator. He estimated that at least 30 planes had flown more than 500 people. He said, "We're going full steam today. It's been a massive undertaking." He said pilots have taken passengers out of town to get medical appointments, funerals, and relatives who live elsewhere. They've also hauled water, food, toilet paper, and other supplies. Most of the pilots heard of the effort by word of mouth and saw it as a chance to use their skills for a good purpose, according to George Richmond, a flight instructor and former airline pilot. He said, "It's a grassroots operation." He said pilots are doing it because it's something we can do. And by the way, this really reminds me of how general aviation responds whenever there's a crisis. In 1989, we had an earthquake here in the San Francisco Bay Area that cut off every road into the town of Watsonville. And for a few days, the only way people could get supplies into that town was through the Watsonville airport. And more than 100 pilots flew supplies in and out of town. Of course, pilots did the same thing last year in Operation Airdrop, bringing supplies to hurricane victims in Texas and the Florida Panhandle. From GeneralAviationNews.com, a study says that pilot turnover in business aviation will be 100% in the next 10 years. A newly released study from flight training provider CAE shows that the turnover of new business aviation jet pilots will reach almost 100% by the year 2028, with the need for 40,000 new business jet pilots in the next 10 years. Nick Leontidis, CAE Group President, said that there's an unprecedented demand for professional pilots and a new urgency to develop better pilots faster. NBAA, the National Business Aviation Association, has been working to help its members with their pilot demand issues, according to Joe D'Amato, NBAA's Vice President for Educational Strategy and Workforce Development. D'Amato pointed to NBAA resources that can help the next generation of pilots learn about aviation career opportunities and connect with the NBAA's Young Professionals, or YoPro, Council. These resources include a new Careers in Business Aviation video and a dedicated student edition of Business Aviation Insider magazine, both of which are suitable for sharing with students at local career days. The 2018 CAE study stated that only 5% of the pilot population are women, and, quote, tackling gender diversity would address a historic imbalance while giving operators access to a talent pool nearly twice its current size. From AOPA.org, the AirCam gets beefed up. Now, AirCam is adding a third seat, bigger engines, a higher gross weight, and an extensive upgrade of its distinctive twin-engine kit airplane. The Gen 3 AirCam comes with beefed-up landing gear, 115 horsepower Rotax 912 engines, which is up from 100 horsepower, a 220-pound gross weight increase to 1,900 pounds, and an option for a third tandem seat. The new jump seat will be quickly removable to convert between cargo and a third passenger, according to Phil Lockwood, who designed and flew the first AirCam in the mid-1990s for a National Geographic photographic expedition. Landing gear modifications for the higher gross weight include stronger gear legs, a beefed-up fuselage gearbox, and Behringer wheels and brakes. The Gen 3 kits are only for land airplanes, but AirCams on floats, which operate at gross weights up to 2,000 pounds, can benefit from the more powerful engines. The Gen 3 kits aren't retrofittable for existing AirCams. The company created the first AirCam in the mid-1990s, and about 250 of them are currently licensed and flying. Gen 3 kits have a retail price of $70,000, up from $5,000 from the standard kits, and it doesn't say here, but I'm guessing that doesn't include the cost of the engines. And I should note that I have a couple of hours of flight time in an AirCam on floats, and boy, that was really great fun. I recommend that to you if ever you had a chance to do that. And of course, if it's on wheels, the AirCam is a tail dragger, a twin-engine tail dragger. From Bradenton.com, that's a town in Florida near Tampa. A Florida man who pointed a laser light at a police helicopter has been sentenced to federal prison. In December 2017, Ryan Fluke, then 27, aimed a laser pointer at a low-flying helicopter operated by the Pasco County Sheriff's Office. Those deputies were attempting to aid ground units in an encounter with a barricaded suspect. Fluke pleaded guilty to the third-degree felony in November, and he was just sentenced this past week to 21 months in federal prison. The FAA receives 6,754 reports of laser strikes in 2017. That's a 250% increase since the agency began tracking the incidents in 2010. Now, as you all know, this is really a serious problem, and I think it's going to require some serious attention from some creative minds to figure out how do we educate the public so that we can just make this problem go away. And seriously, if you have any good ideas on how to solve this problem, please send me your ideas, because this is something we just got to fix. From AOPA.org, an airline is trying to turn its seaplanes into e-planes. Harbor Air, North America's largest seaplane airline based in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Seattle, has announced plans to transform its fleet into the first completely electric commercial seaplane fleet. The 42-aircraft airline plans to convert its fleet of de Havilland Beavers, single-engine Otters, and twin Otters in a partnership with Redmond, Washington-based electric propulsion venture firm MagniX, using the Magni 500, a 750-horsepower all-electric motor. In a phone interview with Roy Gonzarski, CEO of MagniX, he said the first aircraft of the Harbor Air fleet to undergo conversion will be a 6-passenger de Havilland Beaver, with flight tests of the prototype expected to begin in November, leading to certification in the U.S. and Canada. The certification effort will proceed on 2 tracks, beginning with approval of the propulsion system, followed by an application for an STC for the converted DHC-2 Beaver. The goal is to accomplish the regulatory chores by 2021 so that in 2022 people can buy tickets in an all-electric Beaver. Another factor that made perfect sense for launching the partnership, Gonzarski said, was Harbor Air's business model as a mostly short-haul operator. With an average flight time of 15 to 25 minutes on the airline's routes, the Beavers are well-suited for a battery-driven propulsion system that provides 30 minutes of flight plus a 30-minute reserve. MagniX envisions innovations in air transport that could bring down its cost by 60 to 80%, bringing about clean, new transportation options for smaller communities that don't have great air connections, he said, comparing the current movement to aviation's transformative time that began in 1939 when the first jet engine flew. He said, aviation hasn't seen anything like this since. I saw my first all-electric airplane fly in 2011 at Air Venture. Now, that was a converted Laser experimental aircraft. And I got to say, I'm looking forward to my first flight someday in an all-electric airplane. I think these will really be ideal for flight training, since training flights are relatively short. In international news from Newsweek.com, a pilot has died after crashing a stolen plane into a building where his wife was attending a baby shower. Due to the actions of people attending the party, serious loss of life and injury were narrowly avoided. The Mat Siang Flying Club in Botswana said in a statement that the deceased pilot was an uninvited guest at a private function at the Mat Siang Aerodrome. The pilot has been named in local media reports as South African citizen Charles Viguen. The website Aviation Safety identified the plane involved as a Beechcraft 200 Super King Air. Viguen was an employee of Kalahari Air Services and is believed to have stolen the plane before making a number of low passes next to an air traffic control tower at the club. South Africa's Eyewitness News reported the pilot had been drinking alcohol on the day of the crash. One source claimed Viguen phoned an attendee at the party to ask for the whereabouts of his wife, which sparked concerns. Quote, if that guy didn't tell everybody or didn't get a feeling that something was wrong with this guy, there would have been about 50 people dead, according to a man who was not named. Descriptions from the Mat Siang Flying Club aligned with the story. It said members had sensed that the pilot might have had an ulterior motive and ordered an immediate evacuation of the club. It left the facility in ruins. Fire from the impact also destroyed 13 parked vehicles. And it noted that there was no serious injury to any people in the vicinity of the accident scene. And from the Manchester Evening News.co.uk, the pilot who crashed a plane and thinks he's still a hero has been sentenced. This is a follow-up to a story we first reported in episode 102 about a pilot who had crashed his airplane while narrowly missing the M62 highway. He has been sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Robert Murgatroyd, 52, was sentenced after being found guilty of endangering the lives of his passengers, who were 3 bird watchers who wanted to see a rare bird which had been spotted on a remote island for the first time in 30 years. The 45-year-old Piper Cherokee, owned by the defendant, was severely overloaded and was only in the air for a matter of minutes after taking off from the Barton Aerodrome. During an astonishing police interview after the crash, in which the passengers luckily only sustained minor injuries, Murgatroyd tried to portray himself as the hero of the moment. At the Manchester Crown Court, the sentencing judge branded him arrogant, adding that he continues to perceive his own actions to be heroic. He was found guilty of 7 offenses, including endangering the safety of an aircraft, endangering the safety of a person, flying without an air operator certificate, acting as pilot without holding an appropriate license, flying an aircraft otherwise than in accordance with the limitations of the flight manual, operating an aircraft without insurance, and flying without the aircraft flight manual. And finally in the news, 2 stories about pilots arrested for smuggling human cargo. The first one comes from themonitor.com. Pilot pleads guilty in human smuggling case at the West-Lasco Airport in Texas. Federal agents in early November 2018 arrested a pilot attempting to transport a group of Central Americans from a McAllen, Texas airport to Houston in exchange for $3,000. Agents with U.S. Homeland Security detained Louis Luton moments before he was set to depart in a private plane from the Mid-Valley Airport in West-Lasco, which is just east of McAllen. Agents observed a private aircraft taxiing for departure at the Mid-Valley Airport. The aircraft was observed being piloted by an individual matching the description of Luton, who was previously identified as having a revoked pilot's license. When agents searched his plane, they found 4 men, 2 from Guatemala, 1 from El Salvador, and 1 from Honduras, who did not have proof of legal status to be in the country, as well as an envelope containing $3,000 in cash. Homeland Security McAllen questioned the 4 passengers traveling on the aircraft and determined they were all undocumented aliens with no legal right to be in or remain in the United States. Earlier this week, the pilot, an 80-year-old from New Jersey, stood before the U.S. District Court and pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to transport aliens. In exchange for pleading true to the charge, government prosecutors agreed to dismiss the remaining 4 additional counts of bringing and harboring aliens at the time of his sentencing. The man, a U.S. citizen who is originally from Belgium, where according to prior reports he served in the country's air defenses, was still serving a federal supervised release term related to a prior federal drug conviction in 2009, when he was arrested for part of an investigation into drug smuggling. That conviction, which resulted in a 96-month prison sentence with an additional 4 years of supervised release, was in connection with an investigation into his role in the transport of several kilos of cocaine between May 2008 and May 2009. As in the human smuggling attempt, Luton was on supervised release on a 2007 state-level conviction out of Connecticut at the time of his 2009 arrest. In 2007, Luton pleaded guilty to a state drug charge related An investigation that determined he had transported 100 pounds of marijuana from Canada to Hartford, Connecticut. Under the plea deal, Luton also forfeited his 1963 Mooney 20C airplane and $18,000 in cash seized from his Glastonbury, Connecticut home after his May 2006 arrest. Luton, who is scheduled for sentencing on the most recent charges, faces up to 10 years in prison for attempting to smuggle the undocumented people, according to court records. And this related story comes from krgv.com, and to me this is really a bizarre coincidence that a second unnamed pilot has been accused of smuggling people on his airplane from the McAllen, Texas airport, which is just 14 miles west of the West Lasco airport where Mr. Luton was arrested. According to this very short story, the unnamed pilot was accused of flying in 2 Colombians into the country illegally. The incident occurred on March 16th at McCreary Aviation at the McAllen International Airport. The pilot is expected to show up soon for a detention hearing before a federal judge. That's the news for this week. Coming up, my weekly updates, and then we'll get to our main topic about learning your avionics and upgrading the avionics in your plane. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. We'll get to our main topic in just a moment about learning and upgrading your avionics, but first here are a few quick updates. First, I want to call to your attention a recent episode of the Airplane Geeks, which has been very popular. It's all about the Boeing 737 Max, and of course that aircraft has been in the news lately because of 2 fatal accidents within the past 5 months. That was related to the MCAS system, which can make the aircraft very difficult to control under some circumstances. We had 2 guests on the episode talking about that. One was airline captain Jeff Felmuth. Now, he currently flies the Boeing 737-800 as well as the 737 MAX 8 for a major airline here in the United States. So he was able to talk in great detail about the issues around the MCAS. And we also had on Sarah Nelson. Now, she is the international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA AFL-CIO. You may remember her name because she was in the news rather prominently just before the U.S. government shutdown ended here earlier this year. And some of the comments that she made at that time may have helped push the shutdown to an end. So she, too, had a lot of insightful comments about the current situation with the 737. So you may want to go out to airplanegeeks.com/545 to listen to that show, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Also, I want to thank listener Jeff. He sent me a message via Twitter, and his Twitter handle, by the way, is Flight Notes. And he said that a guest on episode 102 of the Aviation News Talk mentioned testing a carbon monoxide detector by placing it near the exhaust pipe of his car. And my recollection is he said that it showed less than 10 parts per million when he did that. Now, Jeff notes that this might possibly ruin the sensor in a carbon monoxide detector. So he said that's probably not a good idea. And he said you might want to check the manual. And he included a copy of the manual for his carbon monoxide detector, which is one of the ones that we have mentioned on the show here in the past. And in the manual it says, quote, "Do not test unit directly with exhaust gas, otherwise sensor will be poisoned." So my recollection is that most of these sensors are hydrochloric acid based, and they do gradually dry up over time, which is why after a few years you need to send them back in to have them recalibrated and also have the hydrochloric acid refreshed. And according to this, apparently exhaust gas can damage the hydrochloric sensor inside these carbon monoxide detectors. So please, please don't go testing your detector that way. And also a note here to anybody who flies a Cirrus. There's an article that was just published in Flying Magazine recently regarding pre-flighting of the ailerons of the Cirrus, and that this requires special attention. So this all came about because of an accident that occurred last year and a subsequent service bulletin that has been put out by the Cirrus Corporation. And just real quickly to summarize it, there was an accident near Houston in which the pilot of a Cirrus SR20 reported shortly after takeoff that he could not maintain roll control of the airplane as the airplane began to roll to the left. The pilot was able to counteract with right aileron input initially, but the airplane continued to roll to the left. So the pilot continued to use right aileron and trim. He lowered the nose, and he executed a straight-in forced landing just beyond the departure end of the runway, and he received only minor injuries. I think that he reported elsewhere that he didn't get more than 100 feet before he started putting this aircraft down straight ahead. By the way, this article in Flying Magazine was written by a friend of the show, Rob Mark. Now, the upshot of all this was that there is a bolt in the underside of the aileron, which was found to be missing. There is a safety wire which normally would be attached to that bolt. And this is particularly important because this bolt is not easily examined, and it's not, frankly, one that I had been pointing out to students. I'd been asking them to inspect another bolt that can be viewed from the top of the aileron through the gap between the aileron and the wing. But to see this one, you have to go under the airplane and look at the corner of the aileron that is closest to the flap. So that would be fairly far inboard and also fairly far forward on the aileron. There is a hole which is cut out in the aileron, and in there you will see a bolt, and you should see a safety wire on that bolt. So you'll want to include that as part of your pre-flight check if you happen to fly a Cirrus. And I also want to mention that I will be in Sun and Fun all this week in Lakeland, Florida. So if you're going to be there, you might want to stop by one of my presentations. If you do that, please come up and say hello. I love meeting listeners after the presentations. Or if you want to meet up to discuss something else, just go ahead and leave me a message via the contact page on our aviationnewstalk.com website. Just go to that website, then click on contact at the top of the page. I have seminars every day, Tuesday through Saturday, sometimes multiple times on the same day. Some of the seminars include night flying safety, what your CFI didn't teach you, and a new seminar called So You Want to Learn to Fly or Buy a Cirrus. So come on and check those out. Those are mostly in the mornings every day this week, Tuesday through Saturday at Sun and Fun in Lakeland, Florida. And hey, if you enjoy the show and you're looking for just a little bit of extra content, go on out to our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, since you're all awesome supporters. And you'll find that there are a few extra goodies you can get if you choose to support the show. For example, our $4 a month supporters get copies of the scripts for each of these news shows, and the $8 a month supporters get the scripts plus a list of links to all the stories that we didn't cover in the news because of time constraints. So, for example, this week there were 10 stories that didn't make it into the news. We also have a number of super supporters who donate over $20 a month. We'd like to thank all of our new Patreon supporters who've joined us in the last couple of weeks, and they include Randy Passerby, Eric Finley, Joseph Massarelli, Chad Cagle, Joseph Alexander, Brandon Dildine, who's a new super supporter, and Brian Wade. And I really want to thank everyone who helps contribute to the show in whatever way they choose to do that. Many of you send me feedback, listener questions, leave reviews on iTunes. Thanks so much to all of you who contribute to the show in whatever way you do. And now in a moment, we're going to be talking about learning your avionics and upgrading them right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Hey, let's talk about avionics. This is one of my favorite topics, but that shouldn't surprise you. I was a ham radio operator for many, many, many years. Loved playing with anything related to radios, and of course also trained as an electrical engineer. So all this stuff to me is just fascinating. But let's talk a little bit about how things have changed. When I first started taking flying lessons back in the 1970s, learning the avionics was really trivial. You know, the only equipment we had in the airplane then were the comm radios and a VOR receiver and an audio panel. Now, if you got in a really fancy airplane, it might be equipped with a DME, a distance measuring equipment receiver, or an ADF, an automatic direction finding receiver, which could receive NDB stations or non-directional beacon stations on the ground. And if you were really lucky, the airplane might have an autopilot, but frankly, not a very good one, and one that most people didn't use. Now, the equipment was simple enough back then that once you knew how to use one brand of VOR receiver, for example, it was pretty easy how to figure out how to use any other brand of VOR receiver if the aircraft you jumped into had a different VOR from a different avionics manufacturer. Now, the same was true for most other equipment in the plane. I did a lot of teaching in 1970s and 1980s vintage aircraft, especially Cessna 172s and 182s, prior to the time when I started specializing in teaching in glass cockpit aircraft about a dozen years ago. But if I look back to that time frame, I can tell you that, frankly, the thing I saw most pilots struggle with was the audio panel, because somehow that apparently was just a little bit less standardized and a little more challenging as people went from one manufacturer to another. And with equipment that was that simple, CFIs really didn't have to spend much time teaching the avionics, and there was very little in the old private PTS about avionics other than the understanding that a student pilot could be asked just about anything about equipment in their panel on the check ride. Well, as time moved along, we started to see LORAN receivers in some aircraft in the 1980s, and then GPS receivers in aircraft starting in the 1990s. But this equipment was just much more difficult to use. Now, there were two problems. First, if you knew how to use one manufacturer's, say, GPS receiver, that didn't help you much if you wanted to try and figure out how to use a GPS from a different manufacturer. And it was really hard to find a CFI that could teach you how to use the equipment. Now, both of those problems still exist to some extent today. A third problem was that the documentation from avionics manufacturers often left a lot to be desired. Now, in recent years, to be fair, the documentation has gotten better, though at the same time, I think pilots now are much less interested in reading than they used to be, and they're a lot more interested in using computers to learn things like new avionics. Now, 1997 was really a banner year. That's the year that Garmin brought out the Garmin GNS 430 GPS receiver, and one of the best things they did for training was that they provided a PC trainer, which was an application that you could download for free and run on just about any Windows computer. And it emulated all the functions of the Garmin 430 and later the 530, so you could play with it for hours. I should know I did. Play with it on your computer and learn all the details of how to use the equipment. Now, by contrast, in the same time period, Bendix King had its line of KLN series of GPS navigators out, and they had only a very rudimentary simulator that you could download onto a computer, and it simulated only just a tiny fraction of what you could do with their GPS receiver. Now, the long-term result was that pilots and CFIs became much more familiar with how to use the Garmin 430 and 530, and it went on to sell over 100,000 units, which is really remarkable when you figure there were only about 200,000 GA aircraft in the United States and many fewer than that in the rest of the world combined. Today, the problem still remains that learning the GPS from one manufacturer only helps you a little in terms of learning the GPS of a different manufacturer. And while CFIs have gotten a little better at teaching avionics, you still have to shop around sometimes to find a CFI who really knows the avionics in your airplane well. Of course, these days we have far more resources, things like YouTube videos and apps that you can download for a smartphone or tablet that simulate the avionics. And some manufacturers also now have online courses you can pay for to learn your avionics. And of course, there are some CFIs that specialize in teaching and creating courses for avionics. For example, Gary Reeves, who we had on back in episode 94, specializes in teaching Avidyne avionics, and he now offers online courses on his website for other avionics. I want to congratulate Gary, by the way. He was just recently named the 2019 National CFI of the Year, so congratulations to him. Now, speaking of CFIs that specialize in teaching and creating courses for avionics, I don't talk about it a lot on this show, but I have a number of online courses available for teaching the Garmin G1000 and the Perspective at pilotlearning.com. So if you've got any interest in learning more about the Garmin G1000, go on out to pilotlearning.com. There's a course for VFR, a course for IFR, and there's another one that dives down really deep into GPS and WAAS. So if you want to learn everything there is to know about WAAS, go ahead and sign up for that course. And again, that's at pilotlearning.com. By the way, if you've flown mostly round gauge airplanes up to this point in your flying career and you're interested in learning more about glass cockpit aircraft in general, there's a free book available from the FAA that you might be interested in. Now, it doesn't teach you how to use a particular manufacturer's product, but it does teach you about many of the elements that are common to most all glass cockpits, because they do really use some fairly standard notation on the systems. So it's called the Advanced Avionics Handbook, and you can download a PDF of it for free from the FAA website. And I'll include a link to it in our show notes for the FAA's Advanced Avionics Handbook. Now let's talk about avionics upgrades. Last week, the AEA, or Aircraft Electronics Association, held their international convention and trade show in Palm Springs, California, and many manufacturers announced new products, some of which we'll talk about shortly. But first, let's talk about avionics upgrades in general. First, there are going to be a lot of avionics upgrades happening over the next year, driven largely by the FAA's ADS-B mandate that requires the installation of ADS-B out equipment in order to continue to fly in certain kinds of airspace. Though if you never fly your plane above 10,000 feet and never fly under or over a Class C or within 30 miles of a Class B, you don't need to add the equipment to your plane. But a lot of planes will need the upgrade, and time is running out fast. Now, when I started the podcast, by the way, exactly 2 years ago, I mentioned at that time that there were about 1,000 days left to upgrade. Now there are just 9 months or about 275 days left to upgrade, and many avionics shops report that they're already heavily booked for their appointments for the rest of the year. So if you have a plane and you haven't figured out how you're going to upgrade it to ADS-B out, you really need to start working on this immediately. Now, there are two approaches to doing an ADS-B out upgrade. You can do the bare minimum and just install ADS-B out. Or you can take advantage of the fact that your airplane is going to be in for an ADS-B out upgrade and that the front panel may already be opened up, so you might as well have other avionics upgrades that you've been thinking about doing done at the same time. And that will represent some savings in time and money since the airplane will already be in the shop for the ADS-B upgrade. And by the way, if you don't own a plane and you are thinking about buying one, you may be wondering whether you should look for a plane that already has most or all of the avionics in it that you really want, or whether you should buy a less expensive plane and then pay to put in the exact avionics you want. Here's what most experts will tell you. If you can find a plane that has the avionics in it that you want, then you should buy that plane. The reason is that typically when aircraft are sold, sellers only get back about half the money that they spent installing new avionics in their airplane. And by the way, the purchase price of the avionics is just part of the cost. You also have to pay for installation. And the cost of installation can easily equal the price of the avionics themselves, unless you're installing equipment that will fit into an existing hole in the instrument panel or doesn't require you to remove the instrument panel at all. So, for example, if you're looking at installing a glass panel in your aircraft, you may find it far more cost-effective to install something like an Aspen Avionics display or a Garmin G5 display, because these will fit into one of the existing holes in your instrument panel, so you may not have to pay to have your instrument panel removed or replaced, which adds significantly to installation cost. Now, here are a few other things you'll want to think about when you start to plan for a major avionics upgrade. First, there's been a big change in the last year, which is that many of the avionics that were developed strictly for experimental or home-built aircraft can now be installed in a certificated aircraft, things like a Cessna, Piper, Mooney, Beechcraft, Cirrus, and so on. This can save you a lot of money, as typically avionics developed for experimental aircraft are less expensive than avionics designed and certified for certificated aircraft. However, if you do buy avionics that were designed for experimental aircraft, you'll need to make sure that there's an STC or supplemental type certificate available for those aircraft for installation in the exact make and model of your certificated aircraft. Now, an STC is issued when an applicant has received FAA approval to modify an aeronautical product from its original design. Now, there may or may not be a charge for the STC, but even if you do have to pay for the STC paperwork, and you'll probably get that from the manufacturer, the total cost is still likely to be less than for avionics that are designed for certificated aircraft. Next, you want to think about what you want to get out of your avionics. And while doing that, you should put together both a must-have list and a wish list. And you can probably guess that's important, because unless you have an unlimited budget, you may find that your wish list exceeds your budget, especially after you consider installation cost. And by the way, you'll know if you have your wish list just where you can cut back as you plan for the installation if you find you're running into budget problems. Now, if you're really tight on budget, you might be thinking, hey, I'll just go on eBay and buy some used avionics. Well, that can work under some circumstances, but there are some major gotchas with doing that on your own without the assistance of an avionics shop. For example, there are many variations of some of the most popular avionics, and it's easy to overlook one of those details and end up with equipment that can't be installed in your airplane, or which can be installed, but at really a large additional cost because you're missing some of the equipment racks or mounting components required to complete the installation. And you really should be aware that if you buy something on eBay and then show up at your local shop, they may not be interested in installing it for you, especially right now, because most likely they are nearly fully booked through the end of the year. And for the few slots that they have left, they'd much rather save those slots for pilots who are buying new equipment versus a low-margin job installing old equipment in your airplane. Now, you may find shops more interested in working with you on used equipment in a year or two when all the ADS-B installations have been done and they're less busy. So if you can wait a year, you may find it easier to go with used equipment then. And if you do think you want to buy used avionics, please consult with your avionics shop first, as they may be able to help you buy exactly what you want, which solves the problem of accidentally buying something on eBay that can't be cost-effectively installed in your plane. But let's go back to buying new equipment, which is a lot more fun and sexy anyway. You can find a lot of information about avionics on the web, including some pricing information. That should help you narrow down your choices down to just a few alternatives. Then, if you're still not sure which equipment to choose, definitely contact an avionics shop and ask for their advice. Remember, they are the experts on this equipment, and they will know far more about this than you could ever hope to know. And be candid with the shop about what you're trying to accomplish. Tell them what your budget is, and definitely ask them for any alternatives to the equipment that you've come up with that they might recommend. And once you come up with an equipment list, well, then it's time to get a quote from the shop for the total price of the equipment, including installation cost. You'll also want them to give you the total number of days or weeks that they expect it will take them to complete the job. And you can, of course, ask a couple of different shops to give you a quote on your avionics upgrade. And when choosing a shop, you might want to choose one that's close enough to you so that you can occasionally stop by and view the installation as it progresses. All right, let's switch gears now and talk about the fun stuff. Things introduced at Palm Springs last week. So from flyingmag.com comes a story that says Garmin's new GPS 175 and GTX 375 offer WAAS and LPV approach capability. They say Garmin just added a pair of new GPS navigators and that they will allow pilots to use WAAS to fly LPV instrument approaches. Now, the GPS 175 is a standalone certified IFR navigator with a color touchscreen display, while the GTX 375 has all the same capabilities, but it adds built-in ADS-B out as well as dual-link ADS-B in via a built-in transponder. So that sounds pretty handy. You'll be able to receive weather as well as see traffic on that unit as well. They say these two units are perfect replacements for earlier generation products like the GPS 150, 155, the GX 50, 55, as well as the Bendix King KLN 89, 90, and 94 series. Both of these units are certified for aircraft weighing under 6,000 pounds, including experimental and home-built aircraft, and they've received STCs for installation in more than 700 aircraft makes and models. Now, both of these units include a color touchscreen display and similar interface that people have seen on other recent Garmin products. Plus, they have dual concentric knobs and a dedicated home button. Now, I got to tell you, personally, I love those knobs on touchscreen avionics because if you're bouncing around in the turbulence, it's usually much easier to reach out there and grab those knobs for some of the functions that they'll perform rather than trying to touch the touchscreen as your hand is bouncing all over. So for example, I've noticed a lot of pilots with various touchscreen products are totally unaware that they don't have to use the touchscreen for every function, especially for things like entering in a frequency, but that they can use the knobs instead. So you might want to check that out if you have a touchscreen navigator of some kind. There are dedicated pages within the GPS 175 that include a moving map, flight plan, nearest procedures, waypoint information, and terrain pages, while the GTX 375 adds traffic and weather pages. And they also have a direct to button on the touchscreen as well. And here is one of my favorite features. Both units also offer visual approaches to provide lateral and vertical approach guidance in visual flight conditions. Now, I first saw this visual approach capability when I started flying the Cirrus SR20 G6, which was introduced in 2017. And that same feature can be found in the G3000 and the Cirrus Vision Jet that I now fly. And essentially, you can now load a visual approach to almost any runway to virtually any airport in exactly the same way that you're probably used to loading an instrument approach with a Garmin product. And it produces a glide slope that your autopilot can couple to that'll bring you down toward the runway. So it really makes flying visual approaches incredibly easy. And it's hands down my favorite feature in the newer Garmin navigators. So you really can't beat the visual approach capability. So the GPS 175 and the GTX 375 are expected to be available this month, and they can be purchased through the Garmin dealer network. Suggested list price are $4,995 and $7,995 respectively, and they say that a free Garmin GPS 175 GTX 375 trainer app is available for download to Apple smartphones and iPads, which is something we talked about earlier, so great feature to have available for that. Now, from aeronews.net comes another story related to Garmin. They say the FAA has certified the G3X Touch family of touchscreen panels for many single-engine piston aircraft. Now, just to let you know, this is not a new product. The G3X family was introduced, I think, back in 2014, but at that time only for home-built or experimental aircraft. But what this announcement is about is that these glass panels are now available with STCs that allow you to install them in over 500 certificated single-engine piston aircraft. So just to kind of review what these products are, they have multiple panel configurations and display options that let pilots leverage their current and future avionics instruments. For example, one configuration includes a large 10.6-inch G3X Touch paired with a smaller 7-inch display, and that configuration can be used as a large primary PFD with a dedicated MFD on the smaller display. Now, another option would be to use a pair of 7-inch displays to serve as a dedicated PFD and MFD. And they say for space-limited panels, pilots can install just a single 10.6-inch or 7-inch display. And in configurations where there are multiple displays, the G3X Touch system offers redundancy and reversionary mode. And what that means, if one display dies, you can push a button and now you can get all the information combined for display on whichever panel is still working. For folks, by the way, who have already installed the G5 electronic flight instrument that we talked about on an earlier show, you can easily add a G3X Touch display to take advantage of the redundancy of benefits associated with that configuration. So they say they've got 4 different approved building block designs using different configurations of the different size G3X Touch panels. And the G3X standard features include synthetic vision, which gives you a 3-dimensional depiction of terrain, obstacles, runway environment, and more. The G3X Touch also has a built-in VFR navigator for VFR navigation, including vertical navigation. But if you need IFR approach capability, then you can pair your G3X Touch with a number of different IFR-certified GPS navigators, including the GPS 175, GTX 375 that we just talked about, or the older GTN 650, 750, GNS 430W, 530W, and a number of other ones as well. Also, the G3X has wireless flight plan transfer, things that allow you to share traffic, weather, backup information, and more with your smartphone or tablet via Garmin Connect. Now, additionally, the G3X Touch can also serve as the attitude source for a GFC 500 autopilot. In that configuration, you wouldn't be required to have the G5 electronic flight instrument installed. Now, the GFC 500 autopilot is available as an option for a number of different models of Beach Bonanzas, Cessna 172, 182, 210s, Grummins, Moonies, Pipers, and so on. And they say pilots can fly fully coupled instrument and visual approaches with a G3X Touch when it's paired with a GFC 500 autopilot and a IFR-capable navigator. By the way, with these configurations, you can also fly a fully coupled go-around during the missed approach sequence after an instrument approach. Now, this is a really cool feature. What that means is that you don't have to disconnect the autopilot when you start your missed approach. And I saw this feature first in the Cirrus Perspective, which came out back in mid-2008. And it is a wonderful feature because when you go to initiate the missed approach, that requires a lot of button pushing, which is not particularly easy when you're in the clouds just 200 feet above the ground. And being able to leave the autopilot on while you do that greatly simplifies the process and enhances safety. So I think that's a really nice configuration. Pilots can also receive and display ADS-B in using the G3X Touch, and they can also display Sirius XM aviation weather if they've got a compatible subscription. It says up to 2 comm radios can be supported and controlled by the G3X Touch, and list price is $7,995 for the 7-inch display and $9,995 for the 10.6-inch display. And now here's a story about Dynon. This comes from GeneralAviationNews.com. They announced at the show last week that they are refocusing their SkyView line of displays and that they have lowered prices for 2019. Now, anybody who flies experimental aircraft is familiar with Dynon, as they are probably the largest supplier of avionics to that market. Of course, what's changed is, with the change we talked about earlier, is that many of these products can now be put into certificated aircraft. And the story says that Dynon is refocusing its SkyView line as well as lowering prices on its original line of SkyView models. They say over the years they have evolved into 4 different models and that they are dropping the prices between $200 and $500 per display, depending upon the model. And they say, we believe that these adjustments make for a more competitive lineup that accommodates a wider range of builder budgets and panel plans. Now, in 2018, Dynon received STC approval for its flagship SkyView HDX system for most Cessna 172 models, and then completed an amendment to include its complete product suite, including the autopilot. For 2019, it's expanding both the approved model list and adding installation centers for its Dynon certified line. Dynon is currently finalizing approval for the VTail Bonanza 35 series, and next they'll be working on the Bonanza A36. Work also continues on the piston twin Piper Seneca, with approval expected in the first half of 2019. Dynon also indicates that next up is the Cessna 182, and they expect STCs available for that before the end of 2019. Now, I recently saw a Dynon SkyView and its associated comm radios being installed in a 1970s vintage Cessna 172. So it was probably an N model of the 172, I would guess. The work was being done by a good friend of mine, Pete Sandu. Now, Pete runs the Five Rivers Aviation FBO at the Livermore Airport here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they now have an avionics shop, and they are the West Coast installation center for Dynon Avionics. Now, Pete is working on getting all of the Dynon equipment installed into 172, so you will be able to see exactly what the full capabilities of this equipment looks like. So it includes a SkyView panel. I think it was probably a 10-inch panel, autopilot, comm radios, the full works. Now, the thing that I really love the most, and it was a small thing, and it may seem kind of silly to you, but there is a small bank of switches that were mounted on the instrument panel with dedicated buttons that were labeled ATIS, ground, and tower, so that you can automatically hop between any of those frequencies for a particular airport that you've selected. Now, to me, this was just a brilliant design feature, and I wish all radios had something like that. Imagine, just punch a button and poof, you've moved to another frequency for the airport that you've selected. Now, the top-of-the-line SkyView HDX has the highest resolution screen, and it's the latest in touchscreen technology. They say it comes in 2 sizes, a 10-inch system starting at $4,490 and a 7-inch version for $3,190. And Dynon also offers other lower-cost systems. So they are continuously updating their list of active and planned aircraft approvals, as well as installation centers, and you can find out more information at DynonCertified.com, and I'll put links, of course, in the show notes. And next up, a story from AOPA.org. Bendix King launches autopilots and engine monitors. They say that Bendix King has introduced a series of rebranded autopilots and engine instruments at the show last week. The company's new AeroCruze 100 digital autopilot is flexible and currently compatible with Cessna 172, 175, 177, and 182 aircraft, as well as Piper PA-28 models. They say the autopilot is available in 3 form factors: 2-inch round, 3-inch round, and rectangular. They say it features 2 standard servos, a built-in ground track directional gyro, track select mode, GPS navigation mode, altitude hold, and automatic pitch trim. There's also a low-cost version, which is the xCruze 100 autopilot, available in the same 3 form factors. and they say it provides all the same features, but for experimental light sport and other non-certificated aircraft. The AeroCruze 100 lists for $5,500, while the xCruze 100 has a list price of $2,600. Bendix King also launched the compact X-Point 100 engine monitoring system for experimental light sport and other non-certificated aircraft. It weighs only 13 ounces and features a high-resolution display that can present a wide variety of engine operating parameters. The AeroPoint 200 is designed for certified single-engine aircraft, and the AeroPoint 300 is designed for twin-engine aircraft. They say these new products resulted from two partnerships with TrueTrack for the autopilots and with JPI for the engine monitoring systems. And again, we'll put a link to this in the show notes. And finally, another story about Garmin. This comes from GeneralAviationNews.com. Garmin introduces ADS-B transponders that feature two antennas. Of course, those would be diversity-type transponders for ADS-B out capability. So let's see. They say that the GTX 33D offers ADS-B out, while the new GTX 345D provides ADS-B out as well as ADS-B in traffic and weather for display on compatible avionics and mobile devices. And they say remote mount versions are also available. So select G1000, G1000 NXI, and G3000 equipped aircraft have a simple path to incorporate ADS-B solutions using the remote mounted versions of either of these two products. Let's see, the GTX 34D, they say it's capable of displaying various ADS-B in weather as well as displaying traffic on a primary flight display, PFD, and multifunction display, MFD. They say that Garmin will have an updated aircraft model list of STCs available in the second quarter of 2019, and that's going to have hundreds of different aircraft makes and models for which these products are supported. The GTX 335D is priced at $6,495, while the GTX 345D is $7,995. And that's it for Advanced Avionics. If you have any questions or feedback, please send a note to me. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. Now stick around for feedback and listener questions right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Let's look at listener feedback. A couple people commented about this. This one comes from Serena. She says regarding episode 102, awesome job about the carbon monoxide detectors. At the end of the show, you answered a question from a listener about using a TAA, that's a technically advanced aircraft, to fulfill the requirement for the commercial rating. He wants to know if you can use time that you've already received in a TAA or not toward the new requirement. And she says you can use a TAA for the 10 hours required for the commercial, although it doesn't change the definition of complex. You can use either a complex or a TAA to fulfill the requirement, which is absolutely correct. So just to follow up here, my answer was technically correct, but it was not complete. What I did say in answering the listener question was that the definition of complex has not changed. In other words, logging TAA aircraft time, that would be an aircraft with a glass panel, does not now become complex time, but that you can use either TAA or complex time to meet the 10-hour requirement to qualify for the commercial check ride. And in fact, you can bring a TAA aircraft to the check ride. You no longer have to bring a complex aircraft to the check ride. And I corresponded with our friend Jason Blair, who's an examiner up in Michigan, and he said, yep, absolutely correct on that. And he went further. He said you can now use either TAA or complex or a turbine aircraft to meet the requirements for the 10-hour commercial complex requirement. So any of those things could be used. So, for example, you could have 5 hours in a complex aircraft, 5 hours in a TAA, and that would help you meet the requirement for 10 hours in complex aircraft. So thanks, everybody, for a clarification on that. Here's an email from someone who wanted to remain anonymous. He said that He saw the tragic accident and aftermath at the Compton airport that's been in the news. By the way, that was an accident in which a Cessna 152 landed, and as it was rolling out on the runway about 10 seconds later, a T-28 landed and struck the 152. I've seen the video of that. It is horrendous. There is just a ball of flame after the second aircraft lands and hits that particular aircraft. Now, he says that the T-28 pilot never saw the Cessna 152, and he thought that he'd had a serious mechanical failure of the aircraft that he was flying. He didn't know that he'd hit another airplane until he got out and was told. And I asked this writer for his takeaways from this. And the key thing that occurred here was that the active runway 25 left was pretty much aligned with the sun. It happened at 6:50 p.m. It was very close to civil twilight. And he said one thing us locals know is that if you are arriving or departing at civil twilight, you will eat the sun. On landing, he said it is very hard to see the runway. So some of his key takeaways were, as mentioned before, us locals know that we will eat the sun when landing into a setting sun. If we arrive at the airport during this time, we will fly around for a few minutes until the sun sets lower and airport runway visibility is better. It's amazing what a difference 3 to 5 minutes makes. He says, talk. Again, I don't know what happened on the frequency since I couldn't hear, but make your intentions clear. So yes, if you're a non-towered airport like this, everybody should be talking on the radio. He said, look and listen and pay attention. If you aren't paying attention, your mind will tell you that you hear and see what you expect to hear and see, even if that's not what is actually happening. Are you sure you heard the airplane that just landed say he was cleared of the runway? Look visually, make sure is the runway clear. He says expedite off the runway as quickly and safely as possible. Take the nearest exit as safely as you can. You can stop and clean up the airplane once you are off the runway. He said the accident aircraft did not come to a complete stop on the runway, but I have seen others come to the airport that have. The helicopter traffic is notorious for hovering over the runway for an extended period of time, and they can be hard to see. If in doubt, go around. And he says, as far as my personal mental checklist, I have already added this airplane belongs to the insurance company on rotation to remind me to save myself, not the airplane, if I have an emergency. He says I will be adding landing environment clear to my mental landing checklist. So thanks so much. I'm so sorry that you actually had to watch and witness this accident. That must be horrendous. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about it with everyone here today. And here's an email from Michael in Wisconsin. Again, this is about episode 102. He says, hi, Max. I hope you are not tired of talking about CO detectors yet. They are so important, and I know you will save more lives getting the word out. I have 2 things to add. Number 1, pilots should know that CO, carbon monoxide, is also toxic to their hearts and can do long-term damage with small to medium exposures. It's a real problem we are just discovering in firefighters. And 2, please warn pilots about testing their meters with car exhaust like the gentleman mentioned on a recent episode. I know the ones we use in EMS specifically warn us not to do that, as the other stuff in the exhaust can clog and damage the sensors. Read your instructions about how to check your meters. Thank you. Always enjoy the podcast. And Michael's a student pilot. Michael, thanks so much for your email. And let's go to listener questions.
Hey, Max. This is Mike up in Boston, Mass, student pilot. I just want to say thank you, first of all, for everything you do with the podcast. I discovered your podcast right about the time I started my private pilot training, and it's been instrumental throughout the training process. I can't say thank you enough. My question is this. When doing a night flight training with my instructor, we had returned back to our local Class D airport, and upon getting an instruction from the tower to taxi off the runway, I realized after we had done so that the taxiway light was burnt out. And I mentioned it to the instructor, and he didn't seem too concerned at the time, and basically said the airport personnel would take care of it. That was that. We went on our way. But I couldn't help but kind of think about it on the drive home that night and realize how problematic I guess that could be for somebody who's not so familiar with the airport. I'm just wondering if in that type of situation, if you would recommend letting anyone know about that. Would it be the tower controller since you're already talking to them? Should you give the airport manager a call? Who, if anyone, would you recommend that you notify of any issues? Appreciate, again, all your hard work. Keep up the great work on the podcast. Best aviation podcast out there. by far. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Michael, thanks so much for recording a question. By the way, Michael and I followed up by email, and he told me that he too had witnessed an aircraft crash earlier this year at his home airport. So again, I'm so sorry that anybody has to watch a crash actually happen. But Michael, great question. He told me that it was just one light that was out. And I told him that you could, if you wanted, mention it to ATC if you happen to have a tower at your particular airport, and they should report it to airport management, but I'm guessing that doesn't always happen 100% of the time. So I think the absolutely foolproof thing to do would be to contact airport management when they're on duty the following day, and that would be the best way to assure that the light gets fixed. And as I said to him, I think a lot of people would just kind of blow something off like this as not being their responsibility. But I really think as pilots, it makes sense for us to take an active role in keeping our infrastructure in shape and report things that look amiss, like a runway light that happens to be out of service. Because, if we don't care and report this stuff, who's going to? So thanks so much for your question. And just to remind you, if you're thinking about buying a Cirrus someday, give me a call, 650-967-2500. The call is free. Be happy to talk with you about the different options that you may have available to you. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And please don't forget to tell your aviation friends how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. If they don't know what a podcast is, the easy thing to do is send them to the App Store, either the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, and then search for Aviation News Talk and download our free dedicated app for this podcast. And of course, those apps are free. And finally, please check out our Patreon site and think about becoming a supporter of the show. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and list a credit card that you can use to donate a few dollars every month to the show. Again, that's at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And speaking of awesome supporters, let me mention these awesome super supporters who donate $20 or more each month to the show. They include Jeremy Zawadny, Peter Long, Seth Lake, Jason Blair, Joseph Haggerty II, Michael Rogers, Michael Spain, Larry Noe, Carl and Ann Rossi, Roger Griggs, Chuck Price, Don Dillman, Stella Sue, Jonathan Weisswasser, Jim Barrett, Fabio Kamlos, Lance Fletcher, Moj Kazi, Tyson Weiss, Adam Nunn, Chris Carnahan, Anthony Pitt, Jeffrey Bell, David DeCurtis, Edward Varso, Jack Downey, Paul Peterson, Peter Alberti, Glenn Neeson, Chris Ostrowski, Stephen Elop, Rob Miller, Michael Hill, Daniel Sternberg, Tim Delaney, Arthur Gunn, Steve Shantz, Chris Buller, and Brandon Dildine. Thanks so much for your contributions, and thanks to everyone who helps support the show in any way. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.